briefly explain us yourself? What are you doing?
Well, I mean, I'm an expert in counterterrorism, intelligence, non-Islamic domestic terrorism in the United States, and sex crime investigation. And I'm a federal advisor and instructor for various agencies, and it's been quite a career for 25 years.
It's, very important topic, counterterrorism. It's always a critical issue.
I have a problem with the concept of a non-state actor
Yes, please,
because
you clarify it.
because there's always someone behind it. In the case of
Right,
Hamas, it's Iran. In the case of Lebanon, it's Hezbollah, which is also Iran. So the idea that, well, Boko Haram is a separate entity, it's not a separate entity. It's part of a much larger global terrorist organization within sub-Saharan Africa. So the thing is that the non-state actor thing is an academic statement, but those of us who do this, counterterrorism, we debate this a lot. Let's put it that way. We
so how,
debate it a lot.
so
So,
how did you consider? But you are not from academic background, right? You are more about intelligent
well, no,
background.
I graduated from the NATO counterterrorism and intelligence programs, and also from Federal Law Enforcement Training Center DLP program. So I'm actually technically a trained forensic profiler.
But I don't know, some analysis from America and Europe and Asia, but you can elaborate your own academic analysis, so people can know more detail.
Well, I mean, I started out uh, being trained in a special program
Right.
back all the way back in the late 80s, early 90s. And eventually that developed into the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center and then eventually NATO. And little by little, as I was dealing with extremist groups in the US, mostly white supremacy groups, then eventually the connecting points with the people I was working with in DC said, you really need to understand the connection domestically between what's going on domestically with extremist groups and what's going on internationally. And everything is interconnected. You know that. Everything's interconnected. And
Really?
I don't think I don't think most people understand that. For example, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Well,
Right.
its leadership were trained in Soviet Russia. They were trained by the Soviets. So the connection between the Soviets, before current Russia, the Soviet effect on terrorism was extensive all over the world because those leaders were receiving training there. They were graduating from university in the Soviet Union and then going back to their countries to extend their ideology of Marxism and communism, the Soviet version of it. So everything's interconnected. Everything's interconnected. There's no there's no lack of that, and I think people need to understand the ideology behind most of this. Certainly, you've seen that in your own country,
Right.
in I call it Burma, um, but
Right. Right.
uh, you can see throughout Asia this effect of Mao and his influence, very negative influence throughout the region. And you can see that throughout the last 100 years really, and its effect. And you see that in Central and South America. You see it in African nations like Angola back in the 60s and 70s. And then you have these satellite entities that were part of the Soviet, uh, outreach to terrorism, like Cuba. I mean, Cuba was being supplemented and still is today But back in the Soviet era, the Soviets were supplementing, they were paying Cuba for its its products to keep it alive, because the Soviets needed Cuba to send doctors, and still do, to various areas of the world to affect their view of the of change that needed to take place, not just in Central and South America. There were Cubans in sub-Saharan Africa, true Cuban soldiers, and then the Cuban intelligence agencies. And you see this effect across the world. Um, Everything's interconnected. There's nobody is acting as an extremist group or a non-state actor without at least the tacit approval of larger organizations. And Hamas is a great example of that. Um, and they're talking now, as I'm sure you've been tracking, about the concept of handing over the Gaza political system, the infrastructure system, to the PLO. That's a discussion going on. So you're replacing one dysfunctional agency for another. I did disagree with your previous that interview that you did,
in this
that
point.
I watched. Yeah, I disagree with her in the fact that she said Hamas started as a political entity and then became a terrorist organization. Well, when they were a political entity, they were espousing terroristic ideas. So they were never just political. You know, Again, the roots are always there. It's like when people say America, it's very popular for people to say, well, random acts of violence. Well, for someone that does what I do in the criminal justice world, that's offensive to me. And it should be offensive to everyone. There is no such thing as a random act of violence. Because if you commit a violent act, someone in your family or your close circle of friends knows your proclivity to violence.
Right,
And instead of interacting and trying to prevent that or reporting you to law enforcement, they sit by or they actually participate. Okay, the Unabomber in America was mailing bombs all over the United States, blowing people up, Ted Kaczynski. The only reason why he was caught was because his brother and sister-in-law called the FBI and reported him. They read that manifesto and they said, that's Teddy. They knew exactly who that was. And the deal they cut with the FBI was, we'll tell you where he is, but don't kill him. And the FBI agreed. Without them turning him in, I'm telling you right now, he was never going to be caught. That's the true story. So I always say that Ted Kaczynski's brother and sister-in-law were true patriots, true good citizens, because they did something difficult. They loved him. They really, truly loved him, but they knew he had to be stopped. But you have people all over the world who are standing by, watching people commit these heinous acts, and they know they're going to commit them, and they don't report it, and
right,
they stay silent. They stay silent, and it's not because they're being threatened. That's a bunch of hooey. That's nonsense. It's not because they're being threatened. It's because they agree with them. So they're just as complicit in the violence as the people who commit the violence when you stand by and support them.
right,
For example, if you remember back in the 60s, 70s, the IRA in Northern Ireland was
right.
it's a terrorist group.
I respect
So
that.
who was funding the IRA? Well, ironically, it was wealthy Irish people in Boston in the United States. They were holding fundraisers for them to buy weapons. And who was the IRA connected to during their reign of terror? The PLO
Oh,
and
really?
the Soviets. Yeah, people don't, this idea that, well, this group is independent from this group. No, they're all interconnected. It's all a web. And I think that's, if anybody's watching this, um, they need to understand, that's important to understand, that everything is interconnected. There are high level organizations that have intention and they fund it or they help cover it up. It's all complicit. And it's true with what's happened in your country. I've studied that quite a bit. We had to study that whole concept, but that didn't happen in a vacuum, correct?
But you explain more about in Burma.
Well, in Burma and Thailand, they've had their conflicts for hundreds of years. But with
It's close.
Burma, you have this across Asia, Southeast Asia, you had the influence of Maoist ideology, and that fueled financially and ideologically a lot of despots, a lot of leaders who decided to promote their ideologies either in an iron hand or economically. So the little bit that I know about Burma, it's what I've read from people that are experts. You would know more than me. Is that this did not happen
We
overnight?
can discuss.
Yeah, it didn't happen overnight, correct?
Right.
So, and so the question with Burma is to ask this question: who benefits from the takeover of the country and the people's resources? Who benefits from that? And that's a question that doesn't get asked a lot because it's not people in it's not benefiting just the leadership of that government. It's also benefiting people outside of that. Who benefits from that?
Right. Right.
You
Definitely.
know,
It's not benefit for Burmese people.
yeah, and that's me as a forensic profiler. As a profiler, you don't look at the outside of a person and say, okay, it's not a gut, it's a science. Profiling is a science. And you have to go deep into that person. What's their motive? Why are they motivated to do what they're doing? Current behavior, past behavior indicates current behavior. And so the same is true of people. It's the same is true of organizations. Look at China. China is a great example of this. It's a communist country. People tend to forget that. But what's funny is that the leadership knew that as a communist country, they were never going to dominate economically. So what they did was they said, okay, well, for all of you peasants out there, we're going to do communism. We're going to give you a little bit of capitalism to make a little bit of money, and we're going to do a little bit of both. But who does the little bit of free enterprise? I shouldn't call it capitalism, but free enterprise in China benefits the leadership.
Right.
Peasants aren't benefiting from that. Mao loved the farmers, he loved the poor people. She doesn't, and so the thing is that and this issue with Taiwan, it's just a smokescreen because I believe, and I think I'm qualified to say this, that there is no way on God's green earth that China in on its worst day, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party thinks that they should go across the strait and invade Taiwan. It makes no sense because they know what the reaction will be. Because what Taiwan produces that is needed by the whole world. The free world benefits from what Taiwan can make.
Right.
So, but now China has another problem economically because they don't get along with Vietnam, as you know. Well, Vietnam can produce, in some ways, cheaper a lot of the things that China produces. So they're in conflict, and China can't afford this economic downturn that they're happening. But everybody knew that China could only go to a certain level of growth and they would stagnate. They have too many people, and that's been well known for a long time. So now when you're having a problem with young people in their 20s, which China has, who are can't get a job, that's a recipe for disaster, right, John? You don't want a bunch of 20-year-olds running around because they will rebel. And that's what we see a lot in terrorist organizations is you have these terrorist organizations that are calling themselves governments like Hamas that can't keep the electric on, can't keep the water flowing. And so you have a bunch of 20 somethings running around, mostly military age males, and they have no jobs. So what are they going to do? They have to get their aggression out somehow. So they fight. And that's part of the problem. That's part of the problem.
We can say it's state terrorism. Hamas used to be a government. At the time, they are state terrorism. Can you
Well,
like that?
you know, I have my own my own perspective on this. I don't think they were ever just a government. I don't think they were ever just a government. And the IRA, you have Sinn Féin, which was the political wing of the IRA. How do you separate the IRA from Sinn Féin? They're together. They're linked. Hamas, Hezbollah, all terrorist organizations started as governments, but they never were truly governments. When you're a government that's espousing the elimination of another group of people, that's Nazism. Were the Nazis just a political party before they became, a world military actor? Would anybody in their right mind say the Nazis were just a political party? From the day one, the Nazis were espousing violence. They did it to their own people, by the way. They wiped out a lot of the leadership in the
Right.
30s. So what is this? The concept of they are just a political party is that I think, in my opinion, is a lot of nonsense.
So what
That's
about Israeli? They kill a lot of innocent people, or they are overaction. It's not considered terrorism, or it's did a lot of human right violation. Crime against human.
well, well, I'm not going to get into that part of it because I got to stay in my lane. But I will say this, that if you take military action against civilians,
Right.
deliberate military action, I'm not talking about, you happen to do a bombing during a war and it happens to kill civilians as collateral damage. And I know that sounds terribly cold. That's different. But if you're targeting civilians deliberately,
Intentionally, yes.
that is terrorism. And that is the definition of terrorism. And it has nothing to do with warfare. Nothing. The IRA, let's go back to the IRA. As you can tell, I don't like the IRA. The IRA used to take little boys, I'm talking about 7, 8-year-old boys, and cut their Achilles tendon. Now, if you know anything about the human body, you can't repair the Achilles tendon. You're crippled for the rest of your life. They did that because those little boys were running messages for the Protestants. What did that cutting those little boy and crippling those little boys for life, what did that have to do with their war against the British Empire? That's nonsense. That's brutality equal to a sadistic serial murderer. There's no difference in the terrorism, the terrorist activities towards civilians and the torture of civilians, beheadings and all of that, than that of a serial murderer. And I'm qualified to say that. There's no difference. These are criminals. For example, Venezuela, what they're going through right now, the last 20 years. I mean, it's a criminal state. It's a criminal state.
See.
They're not a government anymore. Their economy is so bad they ended up doing cyber money for their economy. They're a criminal state. They're not even considered a real government anymore, except by people who benefit from them being a government. Okay. But you give up your right, if, in my opinion, to being an official government when you are involved in criminal activity and terrorist operations. As far as I'm concerned, you're no longer a government. You're a criminal state, an organized international criminal entity. Let's call it what it
Right.
is. Terrorism is criminal behavior. And people say, well, to one man's terrorism is another one man's freedom fighter. What a bunch of nonsense, John. That's nonsense. If you're a guy who thinks, if you're a person who loves the extreme right wing or the extreme left wing, you'll make that kind of asinine statement. But it's idiotic. Extremism is extremism, whether it's all the way over here or all the way over here. the same thing. It's like when people talk about the Nazis, which seems to be a popular topic on the History Channel here in the United States.
Right, right,
Every day it's Nazi stuff. No one talks about the Imperial Japanese and what they did, which was just as horrific. But when you look at the Nazis as National Socialists, and you look at the Soviet Union at the same time in World War
right.
II, they were the same ideology, different sides of a coin. Same thing, different focus, but the same thing. Their economic views were the same. Economic views were the same. National health insurance, all of those things. I mean, when you look at those two, they were the same. They were the same thing. But people don't do that. They say, "Oh, they're separate. They're very no, they're not." The Nazis were a terrorist organization that took over the government of Germany, forced their way into Austria, forced their way into Poland.
Uh,
Um, and frankly, Hitler was not the smartest guy in the world, because Germany's a landlocked country. You don't go to war with the world if you're landlocked. you know,
right.
this is not very smart. You're eventually going to get like Japan. It's an island. You don't go to war with the world or with Asia if you're an island. You're surrounded by water. There's nowhere to go. I mean, they weren't thinking. It doesn't make any logical sense from a purely tactical perspective. But anyway, now I'm
I don't
rambling.
know how you can consider, terrorism when they are committing or when they did action against, crime or any terrorist activity. The period of the terrorism, I don't know how much you consider always terrorism, because sometimes it's
Yeah,
surely also committed in that particular time they are doing terrorist activity, but not continuously. But so it can be, time frame, time limitation maybe the
yeah. I
in
I I see
Ireland,
I see your point. I see your point. I do. But at the same time, it's like, if your goal is not good governance, well, what's good governance, John? Keep the electric on. Make sure people have food. Make
right,
sure they have health. They have health care. That's good governance. If you can't do that and you're spending most of your money on criminal activity, because they're also buying and selling all sorts of things, Hamas, Hezbollah, they're involved in the black market all over the world, right? So if you're involved in criminal behavior, terrorist activities as your primary thing, and what's the empirical data? They can't keep the lights on. They can't keep clean water. That's nobody's fault but their own, because all the leaders of Hamas are all billionaires. How much money does the EU give Hamas every year? 42 billion, something ridiculous
lot,
like that.
lot.
Why is the water not clean? Why is the electric not on? Why are the leaders billionaires? I, Ultimately, you have to look at the evidence and say, what does the evidence tell me? Your primary goal is not good governance. That's not the primary goal. Your primary goal is criminal activity and terrorist activity. So it can be inconsistent, but the criminal activity is consistent every day by those organizations.
But
Terrorism is an occasional thing for them.
what you said, even though directly not involved, if they stand by with the terrorism, example, in Burmese military case, Israeli is not directly uh, violate or they did terrorism, but they are supporting by weapon or something to the military coup leaders. In that case, they are, kind of involving the military terrorism activity. Before coup, it will be legitimate. They are just a cooperation between the two countries before military coup. But after coup, military become a kind of terrorism. They are brutally and deliberately attacking civilian villages. But still, if Israel is supporting weapon and any related spare part, uh, how to measure Israeli involvement? How can you say it's part of terrorism or supporting
Well,
terrorism?
okay, that no, you make good points, but here's the issue. Winston Churchill, one of my favorite people, made a statement. He said, countries do not have friends, they have interests. And
Right,
people say, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that our interest is the protection of our people, protection of
right,
our infrastructure, protection of our economy. When Hamas did what it did, that's called asymmetrical warfare, by the way, what they just did. When they did that, that was exactly like Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked the United States. Because the United States at the time didn't give a rat's behind about Japan. So Japan, what did they do? They screwed themselves by attacking Pearl Harbor and waking up the dragon. Okay, getting everybody upset in the United States. They shook them. The same thing happened just recently. So that starts a war. In war, there's going to be, again, that's my opinion. In war, there's going to be civilian casualties. Unfortunately, it's just the nature of the game.
definitely, definitely.
Even if you're targeting specifically with the technology we have now, specific targets, there's going to be collateral warfare. But here's the statement I've made for many years. My statement is this: destroy Hamas, save the Palestinian people. The
How to
Palestinian people suffer every day because of this terrorist organization that views itself as a government.
how can you separate Palestinian population and Hamas?
Because Hamas they have no connection to the Palestinians other than the fact that they are a group of wealthy people who have an ideology that in the end hurts the Palestinian people. The reason why I know that is because I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, like my big fat Greek wedding. But my archdiocese was started by Lebanese people in the United States. Okay, back 100 years ago. In my parish, in my church, we have Palestinian Christians, Lebanese Christians. We have Middle Eastern Christians. They came from those countries. They know exactly what's going on. This isn't Dale's theory. This is them telling the stories
Right.
to me, what they saw. Because you and I both know, for example, Lebanon. What did Lebanon look like in the 1950s and 60s? It was beautiful. It was gorgeous. Look what has happened. And who was the direct actor promoting Hezbollah and all of the nonsense and all the destruction in Lebanon? Iran, the Persians, right? So the problem is that we have when you say, well, has Israel involved itself in terrorist activities? You know, that's complicated as far as I'm concerned. But ultimately, this idea, the idea of the settlements, okay, what Hamas attacked were the settlements in the areas that are in conflict that they have a problem with, because that's what the settlements were. That's where these people were murdered and kidnapped, the children and all of that. But the thing is that Israel's interest is what? Israel. Saudi's interests are Saudi.
Right.
United States interests are United States. Now we have, as I'll go back to the United States. The United States has very good allies. We have an excellent relationship with the Philippines. We do a lot of counterterrorism with them. And people don't realize that it's the Philippines and the Thai special forces. Thailand has its own Navy SEALs. The Thai special forces, the Philippine Marines, these are the guys that, along with the United States, are doing a lot of counterterrorism work in Asia. We also have a very good relationship with our cousins, the Brits, you know, the English and the British Empire. But the thing is that ultimately the interest of that country as its sovereignty is the interest of that country. You know,
Right.
that's why we've been negotiating, even with Trump as president, we've been dealing with the Vietnamese to counter what the Chinese are doing. And when it comes to manufacturing, and then South Korea,
Right.
they went through this horrible war. Americans died, Brits died, people died, South Koreans died, but they didn't sit on their hands waiting for North Korea to reunite. They went and became a world economic power. Okay. I mean,
Right.
I buy their cars. So I love South Korean manufacturing. They didn't sit around waiting for everybody. They moved forward because the interest of South Korea is South Korea. The problem is that back to your country, you have this situation where Burma is this wonderful country with a lot of natural resources, but because of the dysfunction and the lack of governance and um, the attitude of the leadership, someone has to come and wipe them out. The only way to save Burma is to wipe out that leadership, that current leadership. Well, there has to be an interest to do that, right? Now,
Right.
I'm going to tell you some good news. This isn't classified or anything. This thing heating up with China economically, this issue, I think in the next 10 years is going to bring about massive freedom and change in Southeast Asian countries, including Burma. That's my view because of what's going on in China. Because Burma, with the right amount of investment, can be a manufacturing hub, just like Vietnam, right?
Possible. It's possible.
But how do you stop terrorism? Back to this issue of terrorism, you stop it by making sure that people are working and busy, work, jobs. And right now, China has a problem, and they know they have a problem because they have a bunch of 20-something years old that can't get jobs. Well,
Right.
that's who are you going to blame for no jobs? You blame the government. So that right there is creating its own internal rebellion. And that will spread. Whatever happens in China spreads throughout Southeast Asia. We have another problem. Japan is building up its military over the last 5 years. You know about that, right?
Right.
Well, that's a problem. That's a problem. And I was asked about this
You,
by
you
someone
see
in,
Japan building military is problem or more
oh, yes, I see it as they're
system
scared to death.
support?
They're scared to death of China, and rightly so. So they're building up their military. So I was asked about this, John, about 2 years ago down in DC, why I had a problem with that. And I said, how'd that go for everybody 70 years ago?
Right.
Didn't go well. If you know the history, this is a country that has, I think, this is my opinion, has a broken moral ruler. Their morality doesn't exist. You know what they just did, right? Do you know what they just did this year?
They can
They
repeat it.
finally raised, they finally created an age of consent between adults and children. Did you know that?
About Japan.
Yeah. Before that, you could have sex as an adult with a 12-year-old.
Right.
And a couple of years ago, they finally outlawed child pornography in the country. They finally got around to that. But if it was cartoons or anime, you could keep it on your computer because it's not real people. This is a country that has a lack of morality.
It's an liberal minded.
It's not about a liberal mind, it's about a Japanese way of thinking about things. And by the way, they have a federal law that states that if you're not fully Japanese, If you're in a certain class of people, you can't get a college degree. You can't be a professional. You're going to be a worker. They have their own
Sure.
apartheid. And so the problem is they have depended on the United States for their military protection,
Right.
which we will continue to do because it benefits us. Okay. But them building up their military,
It can
that's
be
just create
problematic.
well, it can becomes problematic because what does China do when they see the Japanese with their money and their wealth building up their military? Does that concern the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party? Of course it does. They're right next door. And who does that affect? If there's a conflict between Japan, the Japanese military, and the Chinese, even something small, who does that affect? It affects South Korea. It
Right.
affects everybody in Southeast Asia.
Even America is what affect.
Sure, of course, because we have interests. Remember that whole
Right.
Winston Churchill thing? Countries have interests.
By the way, are you Republican or Democrat?
I am independent.
Because you know, white supremacy is more, can we say, Republican, right wings Republican?
No, not at all. Not at all.
It's not
Uh,
necessarily Republican.
no, no. In fact, most of the current, when I say current, the last 10 years of white supremacy groups in the US and Canada are actually left leaning.
I see.
So the National Socialist Party is the largest and most dangerous white supremacy group. And believe me, they are not conservative.
Oh, so
They have the same economic views. They're racist, but they're left of center as far as economics is concerned. That
so
surprised me when I
right.
first investigated them because that surprised me. Now,
You
and
also
then
talk
the ones that are extremely to the right really aren't to the right. They're anarchists. They don't believe in government. They don't believe in the current government. They're completely off the grid. They're anarchists. Well, anarchists are their own category.
I see.
So, but our biggest problem, and I spoke at the FBI International Conference many years ago in Quebec, Canada, and I predicted all of the Antifa, BLM, all of that. And I said that the left, the radical left extremists are the bigger problem
Right.
because they have literally 30 times more funding and
Oh,
about 60 times more people. And now we've seen it. Look what's going on in the United States right now.
so which means those white supremacy are more close to the Democrat, left winning.
Well, back in the up until the 70s, the Democratic Party in the United States was known as the party of the Ku Klux Klan. It was Democrats. And it was actually Republicans during Eisenhower's time. It was Republicans that actually passed the first civil rights law.
I see.
And when Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant from the Civil War fame, when he took office, he was very adamant about enacting vengeance on the Klan. So he put together the first national counter counterterrorism group of military people, and they went to the South, rounded up all the KKK, and prosecuted them. A lot of them they just killed, and he wiped out the Klan in a period of, I think it was 9 months. Ulysses S. Grant did that. People don't know these things, and he was
Right,
a
right.
Republican. So it's not a Republican Democratic issue because white supremacists are anarchists or
I,
they're left leaning anarchists. But then you have, you know, the Klan. The Klan was never right wing. It was completely over here in another category.
I'm also more liberal democratization in Burma, and we are far from left-wing communist or socialism. The rest of state in Burma, like central part of state, at least they are socialism or community. They are closest to that. So that's why, uh, you know, it's important to know in US which are more, we can make friends in America, because a lot of them is most they are socialist, I mean left background. They are
Well,
most are not interested for really liberal democracy. And many US policymakers did not know a lot of fund they may give, but most of them may not interest at all liberal democracy. That's why
yeah.
last time also I been blaming the policymaker and a lot of mistake, they did. Otherwise, now we should be better democracy improvement if we uh, invest the right group and the right uh, democracy movement. It will be more, improvement in Asia, because in Asia, you know, it's mixed ideology, left and right, left and Democrat, a lot of things. Without knowing well, it will be difficult to improve or work together for American interests or European interests. So this is
Well,
okay.
it's interesting you bring that up because I've had this discussion many times with colleagues and regular people. American form of democracy is very unique.
Right,
Generally, most countries need some type of parliamentary system, like you see in Great Britain. Okay. Some type of a democracy where you have a parliamentary system, because, as you state, in Asian countries, you have tribalism, you have regional people that have their own regions, and they all have to cooperate together. And
right.
that requires a unique kind of democracy. Um, but at the same time, all Asian cultures have a certain amount of business free enterprise mentality. You go make money, you start a business, you make money. That can be fishing, that can be a store, can be a lot of things. But that's the problem with socialistic economics, socialism as economics, because you're not allowing people to follow their interest and their skill set in making money and keeping the bulk of that. Everybody complains about taxes. I agree. But the bulk of that is kept by the person for their effort, their labor.
But you
So,
said about tribalism and ethnics, that is here, but it is much not complicated compared to American multi-culture. Like you can live together with black and white and indigenous,
well,
Indian.
but John, we have tribalism in the United States. People in Texas do not understand people in Maine. They're very different cultures. Even though they're Americans, they're very different. In Canada, you have Canadians and you have French Canadians.
Right,
They are radically different people. That when I say tribal, I'm talking about that every country has groups that are different from other groups. In the United States, we all kind of cooperate to a certain degree each day. Some of that is educational. We learn
right.
that as a social norm in school, but you know, it's different. Education is different in other countries. The way you govern in a democracy, from a democracy perspective, in my opinion, in your country has to be based on your country's norms and social norms. And getting a coalition, for example, in Burma, getting a coalition between all the different groups, I think the best way to do that is a parliamentary type democracy. You
It
have a
is
parliament.
it's I mean it's understandable different level of democracy, but I don't see there can be different in terms of political structure. I mean, if you are going for liberal democracy, the structure is same in Europe or America or Asia, like liberal democracy. I
Well, the
mean,
fundamentals, the
the
fundamentals are the same.
yes, the fundamental should be same, but many people are not understanding about the structure. In Burma, the main problem is the structure problem. Nobody are building the structure, you know. Military always consider themselves they are above all this political system. It will never happen democracy, you know. There is no democracy structure in America or in Europe. Military are under civilian control. Example, the structure is
Right.
even
But the
parliament,
vet, but yeah,
president.
and that's going back to Venezuela. It's the military. They're the muscle of the criminal enterprise called the government in Venezuela. The military is the muscle, and they're well paid, so they don't want to give up power because they make good money. So I assume that's the same thing in Myanmar,
They
right?
want to be above the civilian, right?
Right,
To be
right.
above. That is not democracy structure,
No,
right?
no.
So that's my point is the structure is same in America or Europe, but the way parliament or president system, yeah, can be different, level or shape, but
Hmm.
the main principal structure is same. So
Correct.
the way uh, uh, we've been talking, Israeli support Burmese military. If they still support in this military group, which means Israeli also involving in terrorism support. So we consider right now Burmese military is terrorist, right? Terrorist, state terrorist.
Well, and we were talking about that in the sense that if a war breaks out, and a war has started, there is a war between
Right.
Israel and Hamas. Once a war breaks out, the rules change. And I know that seems contradictory, but it's true. And even though you're targeting military targets, there will be collateral damage, unfortunately. That happens in a war. And the thing is that if you're targeting specifically, even in a war, if you're targeting civilians specifically, deliberately, that goes against the rules of war, the Geneva Convention. So terrorism can happen in the middle of a war. Terrorism can happen without declaring a war. Is Israel involved in terrorist activity? I can only focus on deliberate terrorist acts. But I can say this, that Hamas has literally screwed itself. It has no support because of the horrific things they did, targeting civilians, especially children. They have created they're backed up against the ocean. There's nowhere to go. We
Right.
will, I believe we're going to see the end of Hamas. I do believe that because look what happened to Japan when they bombed Pearl Harbor. The whole world was like, what? Unprovoked. So what happened to Japan? They were pacified. The war happened and they were pacified. Um, and the same is true of Germany. What happened to Germany after World War II? They were pacified. Now, the thing is that this situation with Israel defending itself, which it has a right to do, and the issue of Gaza are two separate things in my opinion,
Right. Right.
because the Palestinian issue is something that was never handled correctly. It was never handled correctly by the Israeli government or certainly by Hamas because they have no interest in stopping the conflict. Hamas has no interest in coming to a deal. And what's interesting is Jordan, Egypt, they don't want any part of this. Did you notice that? They don't want any
Uh,
part of this
right.
because Jordan benefits from our relationship with them. Egypt's got its own problems. They don't need more.
They are involved because of part of Arab League and part of OIC, Islamic Council.
Correct. Correct. But at the same time, they're being very careful and very standoffish in this whole thing because they don't need the aggravation. You know, when people will say to me that people that don't know what you and I know, they'll say, well, the way you fix the world is, and I go, wait a minute, what do you know about geopolitical politics? What do you know about geopolitics? They don't know anything. They're talking, they're giving uneducated opinions about this. The Gaza situation was never handled correctly because um, Israel wants its piece of that land, and Hamas doesn't benefit from a peace agreement. The PLO did. The PLO was forced into a peace agreement and became somewhat benign, even though they've got lots of money, by the way, lots, billions, but they were forced into that. So there's nowhere to go. Hamas has really screwed themselves internationally because even people who were anti Israel are just really offended and outraged by what behavior was done in this asymmetrical warfare that they engaged in. So I think they're done. I think it's done. But the bigger problem, by the way, is Hezbollah.
I see.
That's the bigger problem.
Because of Iran, you know. So,
Well, because of Iran and by also because of Iran, but also Hezbollah is a much bigger organization.
right.
You know, Hamas is a bunch of punks that really don't have a lot of skills. They're going to love me saying that. They're not much of a professional army. Hezbollah is a professional army.
Right. So
But
related
I
to Arab and OIC, Islamic group, during Six-Day War between Israeli and Arab, is there any uh, similar thing right now? Because during Six War may be different issue. Right now is Hamas issue. But
I don't think I don't
during
in my
Six
opinion,
War, a lot of Arab countries are involved.
no. They don't want a piece of this. The Saudis don't want to be involved. They stay kind of neutral to a certain degree. And that when I say neutral, I mean they play one end against the middle, but we know that and they know we know that. The Jordanians don't want a part of this, you know, because economically it hurts them. And the Egyptians don't want a part of this. So I don't see a lot of similarity between the Six-Day War and what's going on now.
See,
This is a regional war. This was inevitable. It was going to happen because Hamas was not going to sit on its hands. It's frustrated because it has to distract its people from its lack of governance. And that's what this is. It was a distraction. And the thing is that it backfired on them in a big way
but
because
I
they've lost support. They've lost their support. Nobody wants to support Hamas. All the people that used to support them don't want anything to do with them anymore. So what's going to happen? They're going to be wiped out. The leadership is going to be fine. They're billionaires hiding away somewhere. But I think they've eliminated themselves because the Israelis are not to be messed with. They're going to come after you and they're going to finish the job.
because
And
Middle East conflict is always become global agenda, you know. It's unfinished unfinished things in the Middle East case.
well, there in many cases, most countries, including Russia, their attitude is we are not going to cut a deal. We're going to finish what we started, good or bad. I'm just saying that's the attitude.
Right,
And Hamas came into this in an amateur way, not having an objective to finish it because there's no way they can finish Israel. And they poked the bear, and the bear rose up and attacked back. And they're not going to stop. They're not going to stop because in their mind, it's Old Testament vengeance. eye for an eye. You killed our babies, you took our women, you took our men, you killed people, you murdered people. We're done. This is now biblical proportion stuff. And
That's
it's
it.
not
That's it. Day one.
well, that's their attitude. The problem with more with democracies like the United States and Great Britain is that we either do measured response, which doesn't work, or we do diplomatic negotiations as we deal with something, which never works because it always flares up again. Um,
Isn't Russia provoke Hamas to be, more global highlight because of they want they don't want to focus too much on, Ukraine, Russia. So isn't
the
Russia
Russian,
by
the
Hamas?
Russian, the interest of the Russian government is Russia. They have their moral ruler, the leadership, Putin. They have no moral ruler. They'll sell arms to anybody. They'll do deals with anybody. They don't care. And the Ukraine issue, which is was inevitable, because at one point, the problem with Ukraine is it's a very divided country politically. People don't realize that. It's very corrupt, and there's a lot of different factions in Ukraine. But Putin did exactly what we all thought he would do years ago. He's not going to let NATO come into his western border, and that was the idea. That was a dumb idea.
So everybody
The
predicted Putin will do that.
I said it. I said it 3 years ago in a meeting, and people laughed at me and said, "Oh, come on." I go, "Okay." I said it's going to happen because it makes logical sense. Why would you let your western border be unprotected or be dominated by military forces and keep you from your sub bases? Because where's Russia's access to the ocean? All right, in
Uh,
Ukraine. And those, I've said it before and I'll say it now. The only solution to the Ukraine Russia issue is take the three provinces of Ukraine that are loyal to Russia and give it to Russia, and then let the rest of Ukraine fight over control. And I'm going to tell you right now, Ukraine is unified in war, but once the war ends, there's going to be quite a fight inside of Ukraine to figure out who's going to run things. It's got a lot of
Ukrainian
problems.
Ukrainian are still a lot of hope in Western country and NATO to keep stand by until they defeat Russia. They will not give up any territory and anything.
But
That
they're not.
why they
But the
keep
bottom line, the
hope.
bottom line is Ukraine has natural resources. It has food production. It has natural gas. It can't afford to keep doing this, even with Western help financially. At some point, they have to cut a deal. My concern is, and I'm very worried about this, John. I don't want to see Xi cutting the deal because if he negotiates the deal, it gives him power and influence. You know what I mean? That is a concern of mine. But who's going to cut a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine? The EU, they're useless. The UN, useless. Okay, who's going to cut the deal? There's not a lot of people out there that can do this deal that
China, right?
Putin would actually agree with and honor. But
Right.
I don't see any. I don't see. And now with the Hamas Israel war, everybody's focus is no longer on Ukraine and Russia. So people are losing interest, which means that the tide will turn politically in the United States and Western Europe from funding that mess, and you'll see the money start to dry up. And I think Zelensky knows that. I
See.
think that's distracting people. People are very easily distracted. So I think the money's going to dry up and pretty soon. Well, what's going to happen?
Right.
Who's the bigger military? The problem is Russia has been hurt and damaged, Its military and its economy has been damaged by this whole thing with Ukraine. The Ukrainians have a lot of rebuilding to do, which will take them 10 years easily with help. But where is the solution to the problem? The solution to the problem is someone has to give on this side and someone has to give on this side. Basic negotiation. And the Ukrainians are tough people. Again, I have many Ukrainian friends who grew up there and they're very passionate about this. But at the same time, they all know what's coming. They have to cut a deal. Now, the Israeli Hamas thing, no deal is going to get cut. Hamas did this prisoner exchange, by the way, to make themselves look good to the world.
I see.
I mean, they had no benefit. They did not benefit from doing this ceasefire, other than to make the world look like, oh, we're good people. But you can't do a ceasefire and hand back a bunch of hostages and erase in the minds of people what you did in your asymmetrical warfare attack. So it's nonsense. That to them it's a mea culpa, but it's not going to work. Israel is not going to. They're going to finish this. They're going to finish this. The question is who's going to govern Gaza and the Palestinian people.
So PLO,
That's the
PLO
well.
keep
That's yeah. That's the well. Do you want to replace one bad government for another bad government? How does that benefit the Palestinian people? The Palestinian people deserve better than what they're getting. They've been through. They've never been out of conflict. There's no way to live. They deserve better than they got. But they have to decide too to reach out and say, you know what? We don't like the Israelis. We don't like these people, but at the same time, we don't want to live like this. And they are rebelling. Hamas is getting less and less support from the Palestinian people. It's going all over the cyber community, all over social media. They're shouting down Hamas. They don't want to live like this. Who wants to live like that? At some point you rise up and you say we've had enough. Well, the PLO comes in there. The PLO is worth billions. They have no interest in good government because they're living well, the leadership. So they have no interest in rebuilding Gaza.
this
There
problem.
has to be after this is all finished, there has to be some type of true international deal done. Finally, which has been a problem for years. Problem for years. So it's got to get done. You can't have this massive area of land with all these people. These are human beings without good governance. Or the Israelis know that if they get rid of Hamas, which they will, and whoever takes over, they have to make sure this doesn't occur again.
Right.
Right? Well, what's Israel's response going to be? They're building up their defenses. They're building up that border. And what's happening is they're cutting off a lot of that flow back and forth between Gaza and Israel. And I know that because I've talked to people on the ground. Well, that's important for the well-being of the Palestinians to be able to move back and forth across that border for medical reasons, for jobs, for all sorts of things. But now, boom, now the wall goes up.
So by the
So
way, Israeli receive a lot of U.S. Support, financial support. It's because of historical approach or just for geopolitical purpose or
countries do not have friends, they have interests. For example, we give money to Israel, we give money to the Saudis. Ask yourself this question, John. Do we need Saudi oil? The United States?
you need.
No, we don't.
You don't need
Most of our oil imports come from Canada.
really.
Canada has massive amounts of oil reserves. Next is Mexico. And then we have our own oil reserves. We buy oil from the Saudis because it benefits benefits our relationship with them because the Saudi government and their intelligence, which is a really good, they have a very good intelligence apparatus. They help solve problems for us. We pay money in foreign aid for friends. That's how we have friendships. You know,
But
I
Israel
mean,
did not
that's
pay, Israel did not have any natural resources.
well, they the thing is they turned a piece of desert into a pretty lush landscape. Um, Ironically, they are the second biggest growers of roses in the world. Roses. So, but yeah, they have energy, they have all sorts of things, but they're an international economic player. It's not just natural resources, but they don't have a lot of natural resources. That is true. And and it's all about envy and pride and coveting.
I
And
see.
it's ironic because in forensic psychology, criminal psychology, we used biblical terms to describe criminal behavior, like envy and coveting, as a prompt to criminal acts. Isn't that ironic?
You
Because
need
the
more
yeah,
clarification.
yeah, you look at the anti-Semitism, you look at the anti-Asian attitude that you see in a lot of countries in the United States. It's all envy and coveting.
Right.
And ironically, we have a lot of Asian people from Asia, whether it be China or Burma or India. When I'm using the Asian term generally, who live in poverty. They're not all rich. They're all wealthy. They're all college educated. And the
Right.
same is true of Jewish people in the United States. There's a lot of Jewish people live in poverty. So
Not everybody rich, right?
no, that's you and your mind and your bias and your
Right.
racism projecting out your own insecurities, your own failings.
Also, a lot of
That's
white population also in poverty, like
oh
homeless,
yeah, very
homeless,
high,
right?
very high. And I'm going to tell you something I've said many times when I've lectured. Uh, Rural poverty in rural areas, farming areas, that kind of thing, far exceeds the poverty you see in cities. People think that poverty is a city thing, but out in the country, in the rural areas, it's brutal, brutal. I've seen it with my own two eyes. So it's perception, John, it's perception versus reality.
Right.
Perception versus reality. And what's the old adage about don't judge lest you be judged, right?
That's that's why
So,
that's
you
why
know,
we are doing clarification with expertise like you. So Dale, thank you very much for today for your
this was fun,
contribution.
John. I like talking to you, John. This was fun.